All right, it's Monday, and we have to talk about the war again. I have terrible, very disgusting, evil news to share with you that is coming from both the Ukrainian sources and Russian sources. It does not seem to be any disagreement about this. There seems to be a consensus that there are civilians who are trapped inside Azovstal or hiding inside of Azovstal. I guess that's where the contention is. The Ukrainians, of course, claim that these civilians are hiding inside Azovstal because they're afraid of being kidnapped by the Russians. We're supposed to believe that these civilians would rather, huddle together in the basement of Azovstal, which is going to be leveled by the Russians because it is the last redoubt of the Azov battalion, Russia's number one nemesis in this war. Despite the fact that the Russians opened a humanitarian corridor yesterday on Easter Sunday, Western Eastern Sunday. It's not Easter for the Orthodox, which this Mariupol would be Orthodox. I think there's Western Christians in like far Western Ukraine, former Austrian Ukraine. But nevertheless, yesterday there was a humanitarian corridor, and the Russians are saying that nobody used it. They opened a corridor for civilians or anyone in the military who just wanted to quit and lay down their arms and escape. They were allowed to go through. And so that means one of two things. Either nobody inside of Azovstal wanted to surrender. They all wanted to fight to the death, including the unarmed civilians who are there supposedly hiding from the Russians because they're afraid that they're going to get killed by the Russians, so they hide inside of this base where the Russians are coming to kill them, supposedly. That we're supposed to believe that they made that calculation, that nobody thought that there was any chance that the Russians were serious about this humanitarian corridor, and they thought that if they walked through the humanitarian corridor that the Russians would gun them down or something. That's option number one. Option number two is that there's 1,000 civilians, according to the Ukrainians, inside of Azovstal. The military does not want to surrender, and they won't let any of these civilians leave because they're basically, well, no, not basically, they are 100% holding them as hostages. That's option number two. So you tell me, what's more likely? Is it more likely that not one of those 1,000 civilians wanted to leave, that they would rather sit in Azovstal and await their death? Because they're awaiting certain death if they don't, because the military people, the Azov folks in Azovstal, refuse to surrender. They are going to fight to the death. And why would 1,000 civilians want to do the same? Why would they want to wait there to die? Wouldn't even one of them? I mean, what if they have a child? I mean, there's got to be children in there. You don't even think that even if the parents were willing to, wait it out and die because they want to, they won't give an inch to the Russians. They'll never surrender even if they're unarmed. You don't think that even they'd let their children escape? I find that pretty hard to believe. If what the Russians are saying is true, and the Ukrainians have not disputed this part, that no one used the humanitarian corridor, I can only reasonably gather from that the Azov battalion and their allies in Azovstal are holding the civilians prisoner. They're holding them hostage. And so what's the purpose of taking 1,000 hostages? Is it to try and use them as bargaining chips? To try and appeal to, the goodwill of the Russians and say, hey, Russia, you wouldn't blow us up when we've got, 1,000 hostages here, would you? I guess that's one possibility, but I don't think that's very likely. I haven't seen any overtures being made by the Azov folks to that effect. And also, I don't think it would work. I don't think that the Russians are going to, go into hostage negotiation at this point in the middle of a war. I think they've made their terms pretty clear. Azovstal needs to surrender, or they're going to attack it. They've already been shelling Azovstal a bit, trying to soften it up. But we're told they're pretty much going to level it. And so what's the purpose in holding these people there? The only thing I can see is that they're waiting for these 1,000 civilians to be, let's say, liberated from this mortal plane, martyred, along with the folks from the Azov battalion and all the foreign fighters, so that their deaths then can, of course, be attributed to Russia, because it will be Russia who would have, directly caused their deaths, who would have, dropped the bombs, which killed them. And then, this can be seen as, a Pearl Harbor or something like that. Look at it, the Ruskies so bad. They killed 1,000, innocent civilians who were just trying to hide from the bombs. In other words, these civilians are going to be sacrificed at the altar of Ukrainian public relations. The government does not want these people to live. That is the only conclusion that's the most reasonable conclusion that I can draw at this point. They want these people to die, and they want to use their deaths to advance their own political ends. And this is disgusting, it's cynical, and I wish that there was a better explanation. I looked, but I keep seeing these Ukrainian accounts, all saying the same thing. Oh, there's 1,000 civilians in Azovstal, and the military refuses to surrender. Well, gee, if the military is considering that there's no way that the military is going to win this battle, it's a matter of, do we surrender now or do we fight to the death? That is agreed upon universally. Nobody thinks that they're going to, win this last stand. So they have nothing to gain. There's no chance, in other words, that the civilians will survive if they don't surrender. And so, in choosing not to surrender, the Ukrainian military is guaranteeing the deaths of apparently 1,000 civilians. Considering that they're making a clear choice here, a choice to bring about the deaths of these people, it's very hard for me to just look at the Russians and entirely blame them. I mean, obviously, the Russians are waging a war, and I do think the countries and governments and militaries, are responsible for the deaths that they commit, but it doesn't mean that they share, total responsibility. The Ukrainian government is complicit, will be complicit, in the deaths of these 1,000 civilians if they're in fact telling the truth and that there are that many people there. I mean, who knows? The whole claim of there being civilians, maybe that is a ploy and the Russians are falling for it. Maybe there aren't actually civilians there, and they just have a bunch of unarmed troops because, the regular troops have, largely been killed, and maybe there's a bunch of, cooks and, rear echelon personnel. Considering how lightly armed we're hearing some of the frontline guys are, the rear echelon folks might have no arms at all, and so therefore when they're killed, it might be possible to reclassify them as civilians for political purposes. I don't think that that's a major likelihood at this point, or else I would imagine that the Russians would be disputing this idea about there being 1,000 civilians. So, looking forward, will this make a difference? Well, perhaps if they're able to sufficiently control the narrative. I don't think they're doing a very good job of that at this point, because not even looking at the Russian side of the story, because remember, there's at least 2 sides to every story coming out of this war. You have the Ukrainian side, the Russian side, but then of course there's the old cliche, the third side is the truth. But even if you just listen to the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainians do not come across good. They come across quite bad. They come across as people willing to sacrifice their own civilians, which is not what a military is supposed to do. The military is supposed to exist to protect the lives of the civilians. Of course, in reality, that is never the case. Militaries exist to protect the state, and the military would happily turn its guns, on the people that they are supposedly there to protect, if their own people, the domestic population, is ever seen as a threat to the state, or if the deaths of civilians might advance the interests of the state. And that's not something unique to Ukraine. I think that's true of militaries around the world. I mean, hey, look at the United States: Boston Massacre, Kent State Massacre, Ruby Ridge, the Waco siege. I'm sure there's plenty more that I'm missing. Those are just the four that come to mind off the top of my head. Oh, the war between the states, the Civil War. That's a pretty big one in which the U.S. military, was slaughtering Americans, oftentimes women and children. So when the Ukrainians are telling us that their military and their government is complicit in the slaughter of their own civilians, that's not so far-fetched, and I think that we should believe them if they admit it. Now, one last point. I think that there's a question at this point. If things play out the way that they appear to, the way that I think they're going to play out, would this qualify as a false flag? Because, what we have here is going to be the wholesale slaughter of allegedly 1,000 Ukrainian civilians, along with the remaining troops in Azovstal. And this is going to be framed as, Russian cruelty and war crimes. It's going to be framed as if, these poor people, they were trapped, they had nowhere to go, and so the Russians just killed them. When in fact they did have somewhere to go. And it appears to be the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian military, I should say, who did not allow the Ukrainian people to escape. And so, is it really fair to call it a false flag? Not entirely. I think that we're getting a little too far off. It's a false framing, is what it is. A false flag would be if these people literally were bombed by Ukraine, and then they blamed it on the Russians. Like the Kramatorsk train station attack. That's been thoroughly debunked, and that's why you didn't hear anything about it 2 days after it happened. I mean, it was terrible. I mean, there were bodies strewn everywhere. There was, the teddy bear that had no child holding it. They had great pictures of the Kramatorsk bombing until accidentally the media revealed the information on the shrapnel or the remains of the missile that hit that train station, and we discovered, oops, that actually wasn't a Russian missile. And so I don't think we're going to have something like that in Azovstal. I don't think that the Ukrainians will be bombing Azovstal. I'm pretty sure it's just going to be the Russians. The Russians will be dropping plenty of bombs on Azovstal. The Ukrainians need not assist them. However, what the Ukrainians are doing are it's like Pearl Harbor. Think of it that way. Pearl Harbor didn't need to happen. Pearl Harbor was allowed to happen. The U.S. never needed to go to war with Japan. None of that should have happened. It was all, I shouldn't say this with certainty, but it's pretty, there's a pretty good chance, based on what we know now, I don't want to get too much into the history of Pearl Harbor, that it seems fairly certain that FDR and the administration knew ahead of time that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor. FDR did nothing to prepare them for it. He did not warn the people in Pearl Harbor. Just let it happen. And so, yes, the Japanese did kill 3,000 Americans, or something in that range, in Pearl Harbor. But the Japanese didn't do it alone. They had help from the United States government. The U.S. government could have chosen to alert these men, to evacuate them, to say to the Japanese, hey, we know what you're going to do, don't do it. And they chose not to. Instead, they wanted these men to be killed, and they wanted to use their deaths. They wanted to wave their bloody shirt around in order to suck the American people into World War II, people who had resisted entering World War II for 2.5 years, if you want to use the invasion of Poland as the start of World War II. If you want to use the Second Sino-Japanese War, in which the U.S., of course, was on the side of China, that goes back even further. That would go back to the early to mid-30s, I think. And the U.S. was raising money to try and send weapons over to China to assist them in fighting the Japanese then. So, the U.S. had wanted to go after China, and they wanted the American people to hate, not go after China, go after Japan. They wanted the American people to hate Japan for a long time. And Pearl Harbor was their opportunity to make it happen. And so we're seeing something, blatantly similar So that's where we're at, unfortunately. We'll see how the Western media tries to spin this, but I imagine that's the narrative they're going to go with. This is going to be, a Pearl Harbor type of event. Something along the lines of a 9/11, which, has been called itself, the new Pearl Harbor. They're going to try and make this Ukraine's Pearl Harbor, even though the war is already ongoing, but it's supposed to be an unprovoked attack on civilians, and just blatant Russian cruelty. The Ukrainians did everything they could to try and save these civilians, by not surrendering. And the question will be at this point whether they're really able to sell that. Now, if you're talking to someone who is at all open-minded, and you point out to them after the fact, after all is said and done, that there was a humanitarian corridor open, these people could have escaped, and the Ukrainian military forbade them. At least that's how it looks. Or they chose to stay. Either way, it's hard. It's hard to make the same case. It's not, you're not making the case that the Russians are the good guys and that they're, wonderful and virtuous and they're perfect. That's not what you're making the case. You're making the case that the good-evil narrative that they're trying to spin of, oh, these poor Ukrainians were trapped and the Russians, bombed them because they couldn't go anywhere, that is total BS. The Ukrainians have no interest in a ceasefire. They have no interest in surrendering, in releasing the hostages. They have no interest in any of that. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow. I hope that something happens in the meantime and these people get out. Oh, also, I should say, before I go, I hope that Gonzalo is found safe and sound. I didn't say anything yesterday. I wasn't sure really if it was my place. Of course, I'm not a big channel to begin with, so it doesn't make much of a difference, but he is still missing as of this recording, and obviously I fear the worst. He has been an invaluable resource since the start of this war, being someone on the ground there who is of lucid mind. He does not seem to have drank the Kool-Aid either way. Sometimes he says stuff that, if you take him out of context, you can make him sound like a Putin stooge, the way that he words things. But, just because he's not that careful in how he words things to try and always sound absolutely neutral, that's just his personality. Everything that was coming out of his mouth was 100% his opinion, and it was his unfiltered opinion. So he gave a great, man on the street, take on what was going on with the war. And for that crime, and that crime alone, for the crime of having an opinion, the Ukrainians and the Western media wanted him dead. And I sincerely hope that they have not gotten their wish. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.